So, good morning, everyone. So we, up until now, have been looking at how the Gemara and or earlier in our learning, how commentators understood the term tzniut in its, it's not translated or it's not conjugated in that form, but generally the concept of tsanua or tzniut. And just to get us started, let's just do like a roundtable of what are the different translation options that have resonated for people. Because what we're going to do today is shift to a different text in the Tanakh, the only other place where the term appears. And we'll see how there's a different connotation than what we've seen so far. We'll look at fewer texts along the way, and that will bring us up to really diving into the halachic practice itself. But let's stick with what we've done up until now, right? It's been a couple months. What are the translations and the meanings that have resonated for people?
Humble.
Humble. Great.
Discerning.
I'm going to start. You said discerning?
Mm-hmm.
Integrity.
Modest. Yeah.
We didn't talk about this, but I'm thinking that it's sort of a self-depreciating, a means of self-depreciating yourself. There's a redundant statement. And I don't want to use the word modesty because I know that that's one of the translations, but self-depreciating.
Self-depreciating. And that sounds negative. Do you mean it in a negative sense?
Don't mean it to be negative. Not quite sure how to explain exactly what I mean.
How is that different from humble, Peter?
It doesn't, but we're looking for different ways of describing it. And when one defers to someone else, that is a means of self-depreciating.
Okay, well, yeah. So like deference, some kind of deference.
It's the opposite of standing forward and putting yourself forward and always being right.
Okay. The opposite of
that's a weird way to describe it, but it's the best I can do.
Great. That's reminding me of the text of like don't think too much of yourself, or like don't be too smart, don't be a wise guy. I'm going to add into here private. We talked about privacy, and we talked about kind of secret or hidden. Okay. And we talked about how it might not be a translation of the term, but certainly a meaning is of oh, Alex is here with his fancy device. The first thing that comes in is Alex's note taker. Okay. And we talked about like an imitation of God, right? Is an important aspect. And I'm going to put here in the chat. So like that's like a fantastic collection. I think those are all right based on everything that we've examined. I'm going to put in the chat. Maybe you're familiar with, this is a Latin term, imitatio Dei. Has anybody come across this before?
Sorry?
Mom, you're nodding your head. And Angel, you're nodding your head. Okay, so tell us what that means.
Sorry?
So it's an imitation of God. It's not,
Right.
yeah. So
What was the
May-
question? Sorry,
what does
uh,
imitatio Dei mean? So it's
Yeah.
could be similar, not exactly identical to B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God.
Why do you think that?
Well, I think so according to the Torah, we are created in the image of God, but imitatio Dei suggests an action on our part to
Right.
be like God.
Right.
Hmm.
So there's a relationship there,
Yeah.
but not. Yeah.
Could it be what we call colloquially like derech eretz?
So that's an interesting idea, right? We'll say more about that.
Because in derech eretz, it talks more about the action that a person has to do in order to become a good individual.
Yeah.
By extension, the concept is if you walk towards Eretz Israel, you are getting closer to God, right?
Oh,
So
that's
there's
nice. That's a nice
that's
little
where that's
midrash
I
there.
where the expression comes from, right?
I think the expression actually just comes from like I don't think it's specifically about the land of Israel. I think it's just about kind of like the ways of the people, right? The ways of the land. But I like the kind of commentary we get from that though. But okay, so there's a difference between um, uh, uh, being created in the image of God, which is just kind of like a description, versus Alex, what you were saying, derech eretz. I'll put that in the chat, right? Which means it's an expression that refers to just like treating people kind of with good manners, right, and good behavior. I would actually say derech eretz might have a lot more relationship to tzniut, but we'll see that later. Well, the reason I wanted to ask the question about imitatio Dei is because the corresponding concept in Judaism is called halachta bidrachav. I'll put this in the chat, which literally means walking in his way or walking in his path. And that is the concept that is discussed in the Midrash and in the Talmud of imitating God, right? Behaving according to the positive attributes of God. Just as God is compassionate, so you should be compassionate. Just as God is kind, so should you be kind. Just as God clothes the homeless, you should clothe the homeless. Just as God feeds the hungry, you should feed the hungry. All of those kind of fundamental acts of chesed are bound up in this concept of halachta bidrachav. And the reason I'm bringing it here is because it's verbed language, right? Walking with God. And that's what we saw in our text at the end of the day, is this idea of walking with God. So that something about the concept of tzniut, at least in its earliest sense, involves kind of active behavior in terms of how you treated other people, tied to a sense of spirituality. Active behavior in terms of how you presented yourself towards other people, tied to a sense of spirituality. And so there is that idea of we do it because of our connection to the divine. And that's a core concept in Judaism, this idea of halachta bidrachav, which is the kind of the imitation of God, or the reflection of God's positive attributes, which exists in non-Jewish thought as imitatio Dei, imitating God. Okay, so we'll go to the Vanics in a second, but that's basically where we left off last week. And this week we're going to shift a little bit into a different lane and examine some other concepts of the term. Okay, Vanics.
I have a problem with the phrase imitate, and I may not get it right, but imitatio Deo, or imitation of God, in that God isn't always a nice thing.
Right.
God isn't always nice.
Right.
God, what's the expression? In Torah, God's nostrils flare.
Yeah, God's angry and impatient.
Gets angry and God is a destroyer and
Yeah,
and there's all these negative aspects of God,
sure.
which imitation of God would include.
Yeah, the rabbis understand that. The rabbis, I would be careful around negative, but the rabbis certainly understand, let's say, there are less desirable
All right,
aspects.
I'm using the word
Yeah.
negative because
Yeah, that's okay. You're right. So, like rooting it in the rabbinic interpretation, the rabbis understand for sure there are less desirable. Like you don't want to get on the impatient and jealous side of God, which is why they tend to focus on the positive aspects, right? So, and they're very clear about that, like of saying like you should imitate kind of the best behaviors or the best attributes. That would be a separate. It's like a gorgeous text. Maybe one day we'll look at it together. It's really beautiful. But it's a little bit here, but we're going to keep it over there. Okay, let's look at our text. So now we're on page 12. Let me make sure I share the right thing. I've got like a billion PDFs open. Okay, so how does that look for people? We can all see it. Great. So our next text that we're looking at this morning comes from Mishle, from the book of Proverbs. And just to say again as a reminder, this is the only other time in the Tanakh that the term appears. Right? That doesn't mean it's not important. It just means how fascinating is it that these are the terms and concepts that the rabbis choose to hang this practice on. Okay, so let's get started. Talia, would you read for us from Mishle, from Proverbs?
Starting at false scales.
False scales, yeah.
False scales are an abomination to the Lord. An honest weight pleases him. When arrogance appears, disgrace follows, but wisdom is with those who are unassuming.
Okay. So one of the advantages of looking at texts from Mishle is that context matters. Context always matters, but by definition, they're proverbs. So we don't necessarily have to read the whole chapter, right? We can get the aphorism right here. So this is I think it's an interesting teaching. What do you think is the wisdom being offered here? I think the first part is a little bit clearer, but the second part is harder. JPS translates tsnuim here as unassuming. Peter, maybe you were anticipating this. That sounds like that's a good word for what you were describing before, right? Like maybe not. So JPS translates it as unassuming. We're keeping it untranslated for now to find out what the word actually means. False scales are an abomination to the Lord, and honest weight pleases him. This is a bit easier to grasp. Okay? The Torah is quite clear that if you are engaged in commerce, that you have to have a standard system of weights and measurements so that you don't cheat people, so that one person doesn't pay 5 shekels for a gram of grain, and another person comes by and you charge them 8 shekels for a gram of grain. Would be a very expensive grain, but that and this is in the Torah itself, right? Is talking about establishing a very honest and fair system of weights and measurement. And so that seems to be what the Proverbs are saying here, is that if you have false scales, it's an abomination to God. Honest weights please God. But look at this. Yeah, Vanix.
I don't like your example. And the reason I say this is I can charge 5 shekels for a gram of whatever. And to use your example, I can then charge 8 shekels to the next guy. That is not perverting the weight. That's simply charging different people different amounts. There's nothing that says in this that everybody has to be charged the same thing. It's just the weight has to be the same. And I think there are two very different things.
the weight. So I guess you would have to ask the question, why are you weighing things, right? And,
Well, but-
and the assumption here is it's to engage in commerce. And so you have to have a standard
Yeah.
system, right?
but go to the butcher who puts his thumb on the scale.
Yeah,
That's forbidden. That's
Yeah.
clearly forbidden by this.
yeah,
But there's nothing to say that, for example, you can charge, I hate the example, but anyway. There's nothing that says you can't charge a Jew $5 a pound and a non-Jew $8 a pound.
As long as a pound is a pound.
Exactly.
well,
As long as a
I
pound
think
is
it's,
a pound.
I'll defer to maybe people who know more about physics, but I think that that it's a little bit semantics, right? And that yes, the market can fluctuate, but and you can charge more, right? As kind of the market changes and your costs increase, you are allowed to do that. But no, the principle basically is like once you set your rates, you're not allowed to artificially change them. Right? Alex.
I think that there's a big difference between the putting your stomach on the scale and tipping the scale and the false scales. In the first case, the person, the commerce person or the seller is, cheating an individual, okay? And there's a choice of doing it or not. Okay? Whereas in the false scales, there's a system here. It's implemented in order to cheat consistently, okay? That is, I think, what makes this an abomination. When the problem is systemic, when there's no way around it, okay? And coming from a country that had, a perverse corruption system in place, it is extremely evident it's extremely annoying when you see that you cannot escape the model, right? You cannot escape the system designed to cheat, right? And that is what is an abomination, when there is a design, I believe, to take advantage of others, and no one can do anything about it.
Yeah. Thank you. People today who are interested in the modern application of halakha point to this text and to the sources in the Torah about establishing a fair system of weights and measures when discussing the ethics of Uber, because maybe you know this a little bit. Not everybody pays the same thing on Uber, right? Depends on who you are and where you live in your rating. And the argument is that there is not a fair scale because based on some arbitrary algorithm that may or may not take into consideration your identity, people don't pay the same thing for the same product, right? And that there's not a standardized scale, and that there is an argument that, according to one interpretation of halakha, that maybe you shouldn't be using the whole gig economy apps because there isn't an honest system of weights. That would also be a separate class. And interesting to go down that route. But okay, so that's we've just read one pasuk here of the proverb. Now let's kind of look at the second one, try and understand it, and then figure out what they're doing together. Okay, but the second one says, when arrogance appears, disgrace follows. But wisdom is with those who are tznu'im. What's the teaching? What does the proverb want us to know? How does it want us to behave?
Fair.
Say it one more time, sorry.
Behave with fairness. And don't be arrogant. wisdom are those who are, is with those who are fair.
What makes you, where does fairness come for you? I mean, obviously we just read a piece about fairness, so that's right. Is that where it's coming from?
Well, if you look at the two verses together, the whole thing is about fairness. Don't charge, don't put your thumb on the scale, and putting your thumb on the scale is in a sense, it's an arrogant way of doing things because nobody's going to see you.
Great.
All right. And so it comes back, not only is it fair to do it that way, but it goes back to one of the other things that we were reading, one of the other points that we were reading about, and I can't off the top of my head quote it directly, but it basically says the same thing. Don't be fair to your neighbor. And if you go way back, don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind man. But be fair and upright in your dealings.
Yeah. Great connection, right? This idea that like if you put your thumb on the scale, maybe you think that nobody will see you, and maybe nobody will see you. But isn't there a little bit of arrogance to that, right? To say like, oh, it doesn't matter. It's only me that matters in this moment. And we definitely saw, this idea in the earlier texts of don't act in the world in a way that your private and your public personas are out of sync, right? That's where the integrity piece came from. So maybe there's some integrity also happening here. Yeah, let's figure out, so Angela, I see your comment in the chat, why it says unassuming. So let's look a little bit more at the second half here and figure out why that's JPS's translation. Mom, your hand's up.
Yeah, I have something to say about unassuming, but also one of the things that I'm seeing in this is that there are consequences to not acting with snoot. I'm pretty sure it's also in Proverbs. There's that famous verse about pride goes before a fall. This is pretty much the same idea as when arrogance appears, disgrace follows. That if you don't act with integrity or with humility or all those different things that we've used to describe snoot, there are consequences to it for you. And there's something about, and this will tie into about unassuming, that wisdom is, precludes arrogance. If you act wisely, then you're not going to be in a situation where disgrace follows your actions. And unassuming, I mean, we usually translate unassuming as humble or kind of self-effacing a little bit. But if you take it literally to not assume, that to me is like a really good opposite of arrogance. You're not assuming anything about anybody or anybody else, anything else. Whereas if you are arrogant, you are making big assumptions about yourself and your inflated value and others' deflated value.
Wow, that's really good. I wonder if that, I mean, unfortunately, JPS doesn't have a note on their translation. It would be great to figure out if that's why they picked unassuming, but so that unassuming in opposition to arrogance. Also a good point, because you can see the poetry of how this is constructed, where you have these contrasting characteristics, basically, right? You have arrogance and disgrace, which are associated with abomination, and then you have wisdom and, let's say, unassumingness, which are associated with honesty, right? See how like the two stanzas, those two clauses of the stanzas literally mirror each other. And that's how biblical poetry often works and how Proverbs is often constructed, where literally this line, right, falseness and abomination, is associated with arrogance and disgrace. And this sign, honest and pleasingness, is associated with wisdom and unassuming. So it's a good way to ground and interpret. Give points to Mom. It's a good way to ground your interpretation in a way that's like, oh, that's not just a nice commentary. There's actually like seems to be a structural um, support for saying that they're related to each other in that way. Alex.
I think that there is a risk here with these statements because one simple-minded me would like to think that there is a direct consequence, an observable direct consequence for this type of behavior, but reality contradicts that. You know, we all see, or I have seen, you know, in my dose of arrogant people being promoted to positions of power in organizations, right? Actually, partly because of that arrogance. Okay, so I'm not sure whether this actually, these statements actually help build a type of world that one would like to live in. Because when you not observe the consequence that is proposed here, you know, you start wondering which way is the right one, right? The derechated way, you know, the imitatio Deo, or the one that produces, you know, a faster return, right?
So this is a good opportunity to remind us that the dangers of picking and choosing, right? Of cherry picking texts, where it would be very easy for someone just to pick this nice proverb and say, oh, this is how we're meant to be in life. No, right? In a way that's totally detached from reality, exactly as you point out, which is why you have to, when we're building a case, right? You can't just point to one text on its own and say, this is the entirety of the Jewish way of being. No, there's lots of other texts about kind of you needing to have a healthy ego and a sense of you know, your power and influence in the world, right? We could point to all of those. They're not here because they're not immediately related to the tzniut concept, but it's a very good reminder of being careful to overstate the universality of a concept in Judaism, right? And in Jewish texts. Yeah. Okay, I just want to point out we've got about 15 minutes. So Mom, we can go to you, but then we need to read the next text also.
I'm just recalling when from one of our sushi and study programs a few years back with Rabbi Streifer, studying Maimonides, about finding the middle path.
Right.
And that was you know, important not to go to extreme ends of any spectrum. So this kind of brings that to mind. There's a fine line, I think, between self-confidence and arrogance. So don't cross that line.
Right.
And there's a fine line between humility and complete self-abasement. Don't cross that line.
Great, exactly. And this is, I would say, one piece about this, that if this is something you're interested in, and the entire discipline of Musar, which is a Jewish kind of ethical being, spiritual practice, is based on this idea of finding the right amount of a trait in a given moment, right? If all you were was humble and you thought that humble was the totality of that concept, how would you do anything in the world? You would just defer to everybody around you, and you would never get to self-actualize, and you would never kind of accomplish anything that you were looking for. The opposite of that is to make no room for anybody else. So one of the kind of concepts of humility is it's taking up the right amount of space in the right moment, right? It's not either end of the extreme. Okay, we're really not going into that. I love it, but separate. But yeah, so careful when we look at texts. We want to put them together and find what they mean in relationship to each other, and then kind of build an aggregate point of view. Yeah. Okay. So this will be the only other text we get to look at today, is from the Mishnah. It's from a section of the Mishnah called Maser Sheni, which Maser Sheni refers to one of the different agricultural tithes that once and still exists in some ways, there's a lot of highly technical language here. So let's read the text first, and then we'll fill in the gaps. Okay. Alex, can you read a vineyard in its fourth year?
A vineyard in its fourth year, they mark it with clods of earth, and of orla with potter's clay, and grapes with lime which is dissolved and poured on. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, when does this apply? In the seventh year. The Tzniuim, the conscientious, used to put down money and say, any fruit gathered from this vineyard may be exchanged for this money.
Okay, so there we've got the term, and here we see it translated in a different way. We're going to understand why did the English translation of this Mishnah translate it as conscientious. But let's just kind of look structurally what's happening in this Mishnah. So a reminder, this is earliest legal code. It's roughly 2,000 years old, and it's from the land of Israel. So we're talking about a vineyard here, which is likely growing grapes. And they say that when it's in its fourth year, it's marked with clods of earth. So there's something about its status that it needs to be designated in some way. Then we refer to orla. We'll talk about what orla is in a moment, but that also gets a marking, right? It gets some potter's clay, so it gets a different kind of notice, right? And if there's graves, then they get some lime, like limestone lime, right? Dissolved and poured on it. So the Mishnah is saying, like, if you're in a vineyard, there might be, or if you're in like a field of some kind, depending on when you are in the year or the status of the field itself, you would want to know that, right? And you would want to be able to distinguish those things from each other, because we have three different kind of signs that get put up, right? So already just reading this without even knowing kind of necessarily what's going on here, we know that there's a concern, like a public concern, with the status of different types of agriculture. And then Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel comes along and says this applies during the seventh year, during the Shvi'it year. What do we know about the seventh year in the rabbinic mind? What's important about the seventh year?
Isn't that when the land goes into fallow mode?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So the land gets a break, right? And then there's a whole separate system of how you make up for that and how people get to continue feeding themselves, right? And then we get the last sentence about the tznuim, and that's clearly in contrast to everything. So we've set up like what's the norm is everything we've read, and then we hear, well, yes, but these other people, the tznuim, they do this other thing. Okay, so what's going on here? So the seventh year is known as the Shemitah year, and it's when every 7 years the land gets a break. Right? Today we'd call this crop rotation. Right? Every 7 years, the land gets to take a break. Now, during the seventh year, because you don't have this normal operating system of harvesting your fields and going to market and people buying from market, there's a system that allows people just to come into fields and take what they need to eat, right? Because people still need to eat, right? This raises a challenge for several other agricultural sacrificial practices. So the first one is this thing of the fourth year, which in Hebrew is known as netai. It's not actually translated here, right? So let me type it in. Neta revai, which means kind of the fourth plantings or the fourth springing sproutings. And when you plant a tree, you don't get to harvest like right away, or when you plant a vineyard, it takes like several years for it to grow up, but it does start fruiting, right? Even before you're ready necessarily to harvest it for real and to take it market. And in its fourth cycle of sprouting, of like growing fruit, you're not allowed to just take it and eat it, right? You have to take it to Jerusalem and eat it in a pure state. Right? That's the vineyard in the fourth year. the question is, how do you know that, right? If you're just kind of walking around through somebody's field and it's the Shemitah year and you're like, oh, I'm hungry. Like, what am I gonna, how do you know that? So they say, oh, we mark it, right? We have this system where so if you were now, if it's a Shemitah year and you're walking through someone's field and you see a little clod of earth next to the grapes, you know, like, oh, I'm not supposed to eat that. That I can all I can do is take that to Jerusalem and redeem it in Jerusalem, and then I can eat it in a state of purity, right? Now we've solved the challenge of that practice. This, by the way, is why Tu B'Shvat is important when people talk about why is there a new year of the trees. It's not just that it's like a nice day to celebrate trees. It's the day in the calendar where you count, oh, am I in the first year, the second year, the third year, or the fourth year, right? Have I crossed Tu B'Shvat and entered into the second year of the tree, right? So that's why Tu B'Shvat is important. There is a question, just for those of you who are interested, as to whether or not this practice applies outside of Israel. And if it does apply outside of Israel, whether it applies only to vineyards or to all kinds of fruiting trees. So this is an interesting question there. But the point for us in this moment is to understand that you would not typically be allowed to like pick that and eat it without going to Jerusalem, redeeming it, and eating it in a state of purity. Okay, what is Orla? Orla is a prohibition on eating fruit. This appears in the Torah of not eating fruit during the first 3 years after its planting. So now we've covered like 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So in the first 3 years, you're not supposed to eat it at all. And in the 4th year, you can only eat it after you take it to Jerusalem and redeem it. This mitzvah is one of only 2 that applies both in and outside of the land of Israel in this category. And the other one is about what you can and can't plant next to each other. So commentators, even the earliest commentators, understood this, like this was actually a good thing, that like as an agricultural practice, it's not good to harvest during the first 3 years. And that if you didn't do that, you would actually have a better crop, right? And you would have better mature plants over time. So it's not just good agriculturally, but obviously had this spiritual connotation to it too, that you're not allowed to eat it, right? So you would want to find a way to let people know, like, oh, hey, where are the Orla trees? And what did they do? They put clay, right? It's a little stronger and easier to see because you're really not supposed to eat that. So they would put potter's clay there. The graves is just a practical thing, right? Like you want to know where they are, so you don't go into them, you don't fall into them, and you don't contract ritual impurity. But going back to Orla, these laws are still observed today. The usual policy is to destroy that fruit. But you are allowed to sell it to non-Jews. The rabbinate in Israel allows you to do that. The term Orla means uncircumcised. Literally, that's what it means. So some people have understood it to refer to like hiddenness or concealment. Oh, interesting conceptual attachment to some of the things we've looked at already. So that's just practically what's going on here, right? There's a certain time of year where you will want to know what the status of all of these things are, and particularly for the Neta Revai, the vineyard in the 4th year, you want to let people know the only way you're allowed to eat that is if you take it to Jerusalem and pay for it, right? If you redeem it at the temple, and then you can eat it when you're in a state of purity. That's what's going on here. Does that make sense? It's like a highly practical, like sacrificial system that we're kind of looking in here. But does that make sense to everyone? Any questions about it? Yeah, Mom.
So no harvesting in the 4th year, no harvesting in the 3rd year, no harvesting in the 7th year. So 4 of the 7 years of crop cycles, there's no harvesting. But
wait, no, hold on. Let me correct that. The 7-year cycle is a calendrical cycle. Everybody is on the same 7-year cycle.
Oh, I see.
Planting, the 1, 2, 3, 4 is just what you yourself have planted in your vineyard. And the problem comes up when that overlaps with the Shemitah year, right? Because in the Shemitah year, people are allowed to go and take food, right? Because you have to feed yourselves, right? If it's not a Shemitah year, it's not a problem. You're like, get off my property, right? But if it's a Shemitah year, the public needs to know, hey, what's the status of the various trees and crops in your vineyard, in your fields? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks.
great. Yeah. Just to say that again, the Shemitah cycle, the 7-year cycle, is universal. Everybody's on the same one. To this day, we're all on the same 7-year cycle. But the planting themselves, whether it's Orla or if it's Neta Ravai, that's just specific to whenever you yourself have planted it. Right? Okay, Vanix, and then we are close on timing. Okay.
Something you said is a little bit disturbing. You said that in the Orla, you can harvest the fruit and sell it to non-Jews.
Yeah.
Doesn't that go back to what we were talking about with respect to various, well, when we were talking about the first line, the scales are false scales are an abomination, etc. In that you're still not putting your thumb on the scale, but you have two standards.
Interesting.
Selling to Jews and selling to non-Jews.
Sure. That would be, I feel like I will dissatisfy you. That would actually be like a really fascinating like course of study, right? Like the economics of like Jewish ritual and how we interact with that. I don't think there's a double standard here. Be interesting to see, like, are there people who make that argument? It's actually a single standard, and like the sacrificial system doesn't apply to non-Jews, right? It just doesn't apply to them. So it's actually the chief rabbinate's ruling that you can sell to non-Jews is actually a way of just not wasting the fruit, right? Because the Jews can't eat it, right? And so if they're just going to destroy it, it's a waste. So it's like, well, it doesn't apply to them. So yeah, I mean, you could. I wouldn't say it's two standards. It's the same way that like Catholic law doesn't apply to me, right? It's not. I mean, you could say that it's two standards, but it just doesn't apply to me. I don't care. Like, why would the non-Jew even care, right? Like the sacrificial system and sacrificial laws don't apply to them.
On the other hand, if you look at this as the maturation of the trees or the vines, often the early fruit, if I can call it that, the early fruit is needed to revitalize the plant itself.
Right, exactly.
And
that's what even the earliest commentators understood was like, oh yeah, I mean, there's clearly like a ritual law here, but it seems to line up with good agricultural practice.
The original question, if this is an agricultural thing, and the fruit is necessary to revitalize the tree, how can you sell the fruit to non-Jews?
Well, not harvesting the fruit is, right? But if the fruit just, eventually it's just going to fall off, right? Then you can do that. It's actually, normally people are bored stiff by like all of the agricultural laws, certainly by the Mishnah and the Talmud's discussion of them. The point here is just to draw a contrast between these two behaviors, not to like really drill down into like the practical application of this sacrificial system. And let's just zoom in here. We've got this system set up. This kind of the standard is basically just put signs out, right? And particularly, let's focus on the Neta Ravai, the vineyard in the 4th year. That you can eat from that, but you have to take it to Jerusalem and you have to pay for it and you have to enter a state of ritual purity, and then you're allowed to eat it, right? That's the way to do that. But that is the standard, and it's very easy for you as the owner to just like put the sign up and let people know that they have to do that. But that is quite an obstacle, right? What if you don't live near Jerusalem? What if it's like quite far for people to get there? So now look at the other half. These people who the Mishnah refers to as tznuim, what did they used to do? They used to put down money ahead of time, right? Like they would put down a deposit, and say, and they would publicly declare, any fruit gathered from this vineyard is exchanged for the money. It's redeemed ahead of time. It's pre-redeemed, right? So there's something about these people that is viewed in a positive light, right? Most people, according to the Mishnah, just put a sign up to indicate that the fruit was special. But the Tznu'im went further. They planned ahead. They pre-redeemed the fruit before others took it. And that satisfies not just the technical ritual requirements, right? Now you can eat the food. Right? Now you're allowed to eat the food of that fourth tree. But look how would you say it's done, right? Under like what conditions, like with what attributes, with what character traits.
So, sorry, they use the word conscientious.
Yeah.
So, like, I guess I'm having a hard time with the choreography of this. So the fruit is there. I'm the owner of this fruit. I put down money?
You redeem it ahead of time and you declare it. You yourself, the owner, the farmer, put down the money,
Right.
send it to Jerusalem, and you have redeemed the fruit. Now the fruit is available to anybody who needs it.
Oh, I see.
And you haven't put up a sign. You haven't, made any like grand public declarations here. You've just pre-redeemed the fruit. And yeah, Mom.
Yeah, there's something compassionate about it. It's recognizing that people people can benefit from this fruit, in having something to eat. It's kind of similar to gleaning the field, the fruit that's dropped, that it's available for those who might not have their own.
That's what it is, and that's why you need to put the sign up, right?
Right. So
But
it's a good thing to do, and it assures that this does not go to waste, and it also takes into account maybe you don't, like you said, maybe you don't live close enough to Jerusalem to take your grapes and redeem them.
yeah. Okay, Alex, and then we're gonna have to wind down for the day.
Yeah, this story reminded me of the story of the Black Penny. Those who like postal stamps probably know how they were born. And before the concept of the stamp, a letter was sent and the recipient had to pay for it. And there was this very important letter that a recipient could not pay for, and couldn't know that the person inherited a fortune, whatever it was, right? So the guy who's the creator of the postal stamps observed that and said, we're going to make the correspondence be paid in advance, right? Flip the concept, right? So whoever receives the correspondence doesn't have to pay for it in order to see it, right?
Yeah.
This
More
way,
just system.
exactly. This way allowed the recipients to be able to see what they got. If they couldn't afford it, right?
It's more fair, it's more just. It's technically easier, right? Just like in our case here, it's just easier to do it this way. But it also there seems to be like this moral ethic that comes out of it. And so the Tznu'im, these people, are going above and beyond just the basic requirements, and they're doing it though with like great sensitivity and compassion to the needs of other people who think, who are the people that are coming to your field? They're people who obviously can't support themselves, right? And so there's a desire first to make sure that they're not violating a mitzvah, but also that we're doing it with compassion and sensitivity and fairness and integrity, right? And that's why the translation here is conscientious, right? Because these people have kind of thought and done something extra. They didn't have to do this. There was no need to do this, but there was something they went above and beyond. And in thinking of the needs and the well-being of other people. So a different translation, a different concept than what we've looked at so far. There is you might kind of weave into it integrity and modesty, right? Those might be in there a little bit, but there's a different understanding here of what the term means and who it applies to. So we'll see a little bit more kind of along those lines as we continue on. Okay, well, thanks everyone. We read one proverb and we read one Mishnah on agricultural laws. That's where we're at. We're off next week and we'll be back in the first week of January. So safe travels if you're going anywhere. Happy New Year. We'll see everyone in 2024.
Happy New Year
New Year.
Everybody.
and I